As Democrats, what are we fighting for?
Mob rule has come to America, I am sorry to say it. The ancient caution against democracy as a form of governance rested in democracy's susceptibility to what is called mob rule, that is, democracy's susceptibility to the sentiments of the masses that may very well ultimately harm the society, or even more dangerously in the eyes of many of its critics in ancient times, it may very well overcome sound political thinking and reason. And yet, the consequence, the so-called consequence of democratic political organization, which is very much real, by the way, has actually been ruling America for a few decades, perhaps even a century or so now. Despite us being a classically Republican system that has checks and balances that are meant to mete out and ultimately diffuse the ability for a tyranny of the masses that those who were concerned about mob rule had. Today in America, mobs of people who are possessed by different political ideologies essentially force certain issues into the American political conversation, whether they do so organically or whether they do so inorganically, and they then use this event to change how people see their country. This is modern-day mob rule in effect. In order to illustrate this point, I'll be looking at a few movements that I think exemplify the crisis we are currently fighting here in America. The temperance movement, which is kind of a blast from the past, and it may seem irrelevant at first, but I'll get to that in a second. The Rodney King riots, which I personally believe are the precursor to a lot of the race riots we see today in America, and I'll explain why in a second as well. The ANTIFA movement, which has absolutely deployed mob rule to assert its political agenda into the American landscape. We're going to look at all of those, and we're going to try to tie them together to see the similarities and the kinds of mob rule that has been directing our American political discourse for so long. But before we can actually address how those things are examples of mob rule, we must ask ourselves what constitutes mob rule. What is the definition? Mob rule, I would say, generally, is when mass intimidation and the fury of the masses in coordination with violence is used to affect political change and also used to change the perceptions of people in a country instead of reason or first principles being at the forefront of a political effort. Now, many may say, Christian, America was founded on a sense of revolution. What is the difference between mob rule and revolution? Which is a very good question, by the way. Mob rule doesn't actually seek to overthrow the system per se. Mob rule tends to actually seek to preserve the system, and we'll actually see that in a second here. And so revolution, generally understood in most cases, seeks to overthrow the current system to either instill chaos, pure chaos, or more generally and more commonly to instill a certain kind of political order that is more amenable to the people in that country. This was what the American Revolution did. This is what the French tried to do before they fell into a bunch of moral depravity and they ended up killing themselves. That's a different story, different day. This is what revolutions generally do. Now, I would argue, as a historical note, that the American Revolution was actually fundamentally unique because the American Revolution was actually attached to a foundation of axioms and principles that went beyond mere political dissatisfaction. Whereas a lot of revolutions actually lapse into mere political dissatisfaction and anger and emotion, and they have no core ethos beyond the things created by those unintelligible emotions. If your political movement is created by unintelligible emotions, you don't have a foundation for a country, for a society, for a future. All you have is ammunition that can be used for a temporary conflict. But once the conflict goes away and there's no vision that will help guide you after the conflict, things will fall apart. And that is perhaps a caution to all of us in the Western world who are now seeing revolutions happen in our own country that have different kinds of aims. They're not necessarily fought with violence. They are fought instead with ideas. But that's a different story, different day. And so to see how this mob rule has played out in America, let's go to some of the more prominent examples of it. We should begin with the temperance movement. The temperance movement, my friends, was essentially, they were the sort of the Puritans after the Puritans. They were a movement that came about in 19th century America, composed mostly of concerned women who had seen, in their view, problems that happened when drinking was proliferated in society. And so they sought to essentially discourage drinking through social and political means. Now, there was this lady called Carrie Nation, who came towards the tail end of the temperance movement in the early 20th century. And Carrie Nation was known for carrying around a hatchet, going into saloons and other places that sold alcohol, even if they didn't even drink alcohol. She went there just to, if they even served alcohol, and she would destroy the property with her hatchet. Not only that, but Carrie Nation actually led raids into these establishments, and they would all destroy things and terrorize the patrons of these establishments. Now, how does this interact with mob rule? Well, very simply. Carrie Nation was a part of a broader effort to criminalize the consumption of alcohol, which essentially is what happened in the successor of the temperance movement, which was prohibition, which essentially added a constitutional amendment, which indeed did criminalize the consumption of alcohol. It was mob rule on a social level that was executed through violence, executed through propaganda, and executed through mere moral sentiments that had no grounding in first principles or the rational assessment of those morals, which led to the banning of alcohol on an institutional level in America. Now, why am I saying that this has to do with mob rule? And the important point is this. Alcohol was not banned because of a consideration or a debate that happened on the basis of principles. It was banned because there was a lot of intimidation, violence, and chaos that happened in society that eventually moved it to be banned in the political realm. This is one of those rare instances of politics, of culture rather, impacting politics as opposed to politics impacting culture. There's this myth that goes around that says that if you change the culture, you'll change the political system. Well, unfortunately, the culture and the political system that exist in the public and the private sphere are impacted and governed by two different sets of rules that don't respect each other and are antithetical to each other, as water and oil are also antithetical to each other. And so this is actually another example of mob rule preserving the system, because Carrie Nation didn't want to overthrow the government. She wanted to use the government to further her own aims of banning something that she personally found to be vile. So she forgot the principle of private property. She forgot the principle of self-determination. She forgot the importance of individuals being able to govern themselves and use their freedom to push themselves towards virtue. And she used violence and intimidation to instill a political order that would not have existed if she and others had not acted in that same way. Now, of course, the problem is the effects of mob rule are ephemeral. They tend to go away after a while, which is why prohibition ultimately failed. So that is perhaps one of the more prominent early examples of it. Now we fast forward perhaps 50, 60, 80 years in the future, and we go towards the Rodney King riots. Now, for those of you who know, I'm sure some of you actually were alive when this happened. Rodney King was an individual who had an encounter with the police. He was beaten brutally, and it was filmed by an onlooker who had a camcorder. Well, when this video got out in the early 90s, Los Angeles and surrounding cities kind of just erupted into a furor of anger. The African American and Latino communities of those cities were quite upset. They were so upset that they decided to go out and kill people and destroy things. Over 3,000 businesses burned. A lot of people were injured. Thousands of people were injured. Truckers were pulled from their trucks, and they were beat up by ravenous mobs of people who were mad about what happened. There's of course these famous images of Asian shop owners that's sitting on their roofs with their guns, defending their property, so on and so forth. And the important thing about this is that for a very significant period of time, Los Angeles was suspended under a state of pure and utter chaos and intimidation and mob rule, which impacted the perceptions of people around America concerning race relations. It's oftentimes admitted The Rodney King riots was a turning point in race relations in America. So not only do we see mob rule moving us towards a political conclusion, we also see mob rule moving us towards an intellectual conclusion. Because if your intellectual understanding of your society is cast in terms of mobs, groups, collectives, and it's bound up in that kind of thinking, and you admit no other level of analysis to enlighten your thinking, you will think on the level of mobs, groups, and collectives. You will not see society as this sort of tapestry, this broad tapestry of many different colors. You will see society on such a boilerplate limited level where you see things happening on one plane, one single plane. So we see right now. A lot of times when we see something on social media, many of us will say, well, that looks bad. We must be doomed. I've seen it all the time where some stupid person on social media is speaking some nonsense, and everyone takes that single instance to mean something greater about the whole world they live in. This is a confirmation bias. This is a sampling bias. This is not logical, but this is the kind of thinking that mob rule pushes us towards. It's not just a political phenomenon. It's a psychological phenomenon that has political and social consequences for a nation. And that intellectual seed planted by the Rodney King riots germinated in the sort of acquitting of O.J. Simpson, who passed recently, in that same city where the Rodney King riots happened. It was obvious to anyone with a brain and eyes that O.J. Simpson absolutely killed his wife, his fiancée rather. But the jurors even admitted that they acquitted O.J. to fight the system. So mob rule took their decision making from a standard of justice, which is universal and has very specific requirements that it needs to be fulfilled, to one of social justice and favoritism, which is bound up in the politics of power and race, and then use that to make a determination that ultimately impacted the lives of an entire family and the perception of an entire nation of their justice system. That was mob rule. And then you fast forward all the way towards our modern day, where you see cities like Baltimore, like Ferguson, like all these different cities, Minneapolis, throughout the various Black Lives Matter rallies and movements burning down to the ground. And the police during those instances, they didn't intervene. And when they did intervene, they received a lot of criticism. And out of this furor from the BLM movement spawned the defund the police movement, which several progressive jurisdictions actually enacted. It was the mob rule that burnt down cities, that said that property doesn't really matter, that you can just use insurance to cover it, that destroyed their own communities, which then produced another intellectual and social movement that ultimately harmed their own communities by pursuing a defunding regime against the cops. It's mob rule that has been guiding the race discourse in America for the past decade or so. It cries all the way back to Rodney King, and even beyond that. It's mob rule. Another example is Antifa. Antifa is known for making autonomous zones, the most famous of which was in Seattle, where they quite literally took over the Capitol Hill neighborhood, where people live, people have shops. They declared that it was a lawless zone, enforced by their laws. People die within that zone. And Antifa walked around, patrolled, they had guns, and the cops did nothing. Because the cops didn't want to be seen as on the wrong side of the issue that Antifa represented. Well, this was mob rule, quite literally, because they were using that violence, that intimidation, to suspend any consideration of the actual issues and any actual valid way of participating in the community, and use violence to drive their own agendas. And of course, what do we know about Chaz Chop? It was an absolute den of depravity. There were drugs, there was violence, there was all kinds of horrible things that happened. And there was no way to stop it, because the overshadowing issue was not that those things were happening. The overshadowing issue was this totalizing idea of an injustice that has to be rectified by any means necessary. I can keep going on and on and on and on. Now, there are different ways to see these phenomena that I've talked about, and to see mob rule generally in America. One of the ways people like to see it is as inorganic creations of NGOs like George Soros or other people who seek to instill social discord in America. And while this does happen, we should not be too deterministic in our language to assume that every instance of mob rule, every instance of social chaos is manufactured. People who think this, I think they buy too much into the power worldview analysis, where everything that happens in society is engineered either by propaganda or by some kind of law or some kind of nefarious actors. Sometimes people just get angry and their passion overtakes their reason and their passion guides them. Mob rule, I think, primarily emerges from the unchecked passions of the masses that are then not met by a significant resisting force from the police or any other institution, social or political, that are meant to correct those passions in a Republican system. And this is produced and made more easier to germinate in our social environment by mentalities that quite literally disable conversation on those issues. When you had during BLM people saying white folks can't talk about black issues, that then disables people from being able to actively confront these issues in any form, whether it be on an interpersonal form where they talk to others, or whether it be as mayor of Seattle where they try to address something that's happening in their city, but they're too scared of being called racist or bigoted, so they don't do it. Mediocre moral concepts produce dangerous political situations. And mob rule it pushes forth both of those things in order to have its hold on people. So people are mistaken when they ask the question, cui bono, not because who benefits or who's funding people, it doesn't matter, but because sometimes looking at who funds people is less important than actually evaluating the people who are being funded and how their movement came about. And that, my friends, again, as I mentioned, is an example of mob rule. There's also a connection between mob rule and mass migration. Look at England, where there are entire towns that have been overtaken by Islamic majorities that instill Sharia informally in those towns, and the police and British law is suspended in those areas. And any consideration of the law of the country is furloughed and is just torn aside for the considerations of being an acceptable multiculturalist society. That's an example of mob rule. It's the intimidation, it's the mass effect that produces political instability and political ignorance that then creates these situations that are just discordant, and they are not at all good. But then the response to this is even more interesting, because the response for a lot of people would be, well, we have to become a mob ourselves. We have to organize and we have to fight. Or the response for some people would be what they call the friend-enemy distinction. And this is the idea that politics is just about who is your friend and who is your enemy. And there's no differences in between. There's no nuance in between. And you fight your enemies and you keep your friends close. Well, the problem with this is your enemy can be an enemy one day and a friend the next day. And if you look at politics on the basis of utility, not on the basis of principle, you will never get a stable society or have a stable political order. This mentality harms the political order. This is the effect of mob rule, a destabilizing force on our society. My friends, America needs to reclaim its classically Republican roots. And we need to fight the psychological and the political effects of mob rule before they continue to tear our republic apart. Unfortunately, there are many interested actors that would like to keep these trends going. And unfortunately, we have a very uneducated and a very morally immature populace that in some respects would also like to keep their passions at the forefront of their political and social considerations, this virtue signaling, as opposed to addressing issues rationally. But those of us who are rational, those of us who do love this country, and those of us who want to see a better future for this country, and those of us who want to see this country stay true to its actual roots, must fight back against mob rule by pushing knowledge over ignorance, by pushing debate over violence, by pushing reason over superstition and over passion and emotion, and by fundamentally demanding that our institutions step up and correct the wild masses when they seek to govern this country under an illegitimate form of governing order that is mob rule, and demand that our governing order remain as it is. That is what being a conservative means in 2024. It doesn't just mean you want to keep things from the past. It means you want to fundamentally keep what keeps society together intact within the context of moral limitations. That is how we beat mob rule. But before we can beat mob rule, we must admit that America, my friends, is under the rule of mob rule. It has come to our shores. And in my opinion, it's probably just getting started, unless we patriots step up and correct it in due time. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe if you like this channel. Help me get my message out there. Study history, study philosophy, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.